This land's secrets are mine to keep. You will obey or suffer the consequences. You will learn your place. Obey, and you may yet find mercy.
What if the darkest secret on a plantation wasn't what people saw, but what everyone chose not to speak about? Welcome to Story of the Black Past, a place where we uncover powerful and often hidden realities from history. Stories of silence, power, and the truths that were buried to protect reputations rather than people. If you are new here, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this video. We always love to see how far our stories travel. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Thank you for being here. Now relax, avoid all distractions, and pay close attention. Watch until the very end, because what you are about to hear is something history rarely speaks about openly. Tonight, we travel to rural Georgia in the year 1847, a place where power did not always look like force. Sometimes it looked like silence. Sometimes it looked like control hidden behind order. This is the story of a plantation where something deeply unsettling existed, not in plain sight, but in what people refused to acknowledge. The woman who owned the estate was known for discipline, structure, control. Her household ran differently, not louder, not harsher, but more controlled. Everything was observed, everything was measured. Nothing was left to chance. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The plantation functioned, work continued, life moved in the same patterns as others around it. But over time, something began to stand out, not in what was done openly, but in what was never spoken about. Children on the plantation began to raise quiet questions, not loudly, not directly, but through resemblance, through patterns, through details that did not align with what was expected, faces that carried similarities where none should exist, connections that were never acknowledged, but never fully denied. At first, these things were ignored, dismissed, because acknowledging them would mean confronting something uncomfortable, something that could not be easily explained away. The enslaved people noticed. Of course they did, but they did not speak openly, because speaking openly was not safe. So the awareness moved quietly, through looks, through silence, through the understanding that something was wrong but could not be challenged. The sons of the plantation owner moved freely, untouched by suspicion, untouched by consequence, because power protects itself, and what exists under power often remains hidden. The woman at the center of it all remained composed, unchanged, as if everything around her followed exactly as intended. And that is what made it more unsettling, because nothing appeared out of control, nothing appeared accidental, everything felt managed. As time passed, the pattern became harder to ignore, not because it became louder, but because it became consistent. And consistency reveals intention. Even when nothing is spoken, the community around the plantation began to sense it. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. Enough to create distance, enough to create quiet avoidance, because some things, once suspected, are too heavy to confront, and easier to leave unspoken. This was not a secret hidden by accident. It was a silence maintained by power, a system within a system, one that relied not on force alone, but on control of what could be seen and what must never be said. And once something like that exists, it does not disappear, it remains, quietly, through time, through silence, through the people who were forced to carry it without ever being allowed to name it. The silence surrounding that plantation in Georgia did not break. It settled, deeper, into everything, because what was happening did not need to be spoken to exist. It was seen, felt, understood without words, and that kind of understanding is the hardest to escape. The enslaved people adjusted, not by accepting it, but by learning how to live around it, because survival often means recognizing what cannot be changed in the moment, and moving carefully within it. They noticed the patterns, the similarities, the unspoken connections, but they carried that knowledge quietly, because knowledge, in that space, was dangerous. Not because it was false, but because it was true, and truth, when it challenges power, is often the most dangerous thing of all. The sons continued as they always had, untouched, unaffected. Because nothing around them forced change. No questions, no consequences, only silence. And silence protects what it surrounds. The plantation owner maintained control, not through visible force, but through structure, through the careful shaping of what could be acknowledged and what must remain unseen. Because control is not only about action, it is about perception, about deciding what is real in the eyes of others. And once perception is controlled, everything else follows. The community outside the plantation kept their distance, not openly, but intentionally. Because even without full understanding, they sensed something. Something that did not align with what should be. And when something feels wrong but cannot be proven, people do not confront it. They avoid it. And avoidance becomes its own form of silence. Time passed. And with time, the details blurred. Not because they disappeared, but because they were never recorded, never confirmed, never allowed to become part of what was officially known. And that is how some truths are erased. Not by removing them, but by refusing to acknowledge them. What existed on that plantation was not just an act, it was a system. A quiet, controlled system that depended on silence to survive. And that silence was not accidental, it was maintained, protected, reinforced, because once it is broken, everything changes. And those in power understood that, which is why it remained unbroken. For as long as it did, the people who lived within it carried that weight. Not visibly, not loudly, but internally, because some experiences do not leave marks that can be seen, they leave something else, something deeper, something that remains even when everything else moves on. This was not just about what happened, it was about what was hidden, what was protected, what was allowed to exist because no one was permitted to speak it. And once something like that exists, it does not simply disappear through memory, through absence, through the things that are never said, but always known. And even as the years moved forward in Georgia, what had been hidden did not disappear. It settled into memory, into silence, into the quiet understanding carried by those who had lived within it. Because when something is never spoken, it does not end. It lingers, in fragments, in impressions, in the way people remember without saying. The plantation itself continued, new routines, new faces, new generations. But the structure that allowed that silence remained. Not always in the same form, but in the same pattern, because once a system of silence is established, it does not vanish easily. It adapts, it shifts, it continues in quieter ways. The people who had witnessed it carried it with them. Not as a story they could tell, but as something they could not forget. And that kind of memory is different. It does not live in words. It lives in feeling, in awareness, in the quiet moments where something returns without explanation. The outside world never fully knew. Not in detail, not in truth, only in fragments, in rumors that never formed into certainty. And because they never formed, they were never confronted. They were allowed to fade at the surface, while remaining underneath. That is how silence protects itself. It does not deny. It simply prevents clarity. And without clarity, there is no action, only distance. What existed there was not just hidden, it was sustained. Sustained by power, sustained by fear, sustained by the control of what could and could not be spoken. And that kind of system leaves something behind. Not visible, not recorded, but real. A lasting impact on those who lived within it. And even on those who only sensed it from a distance. Because once something like that exists, it does not end when the moment ends. It continues. In the way history is incomplete, in the way some truths are never fully told, in the way silence becomes part of the record itself. Not in exposure, not in resolution, but in that silence. A silence that remains, quietly, through time, through memory, through everything that was never allowed to be said. And once something is held in silence for long enough, it becomes something else, not forgotten, but buried. And what is buried does not disappear. It remains, waiting, in the spaces where history never fully reaches. And once it is felt, even briefly, it cannot be unfelt. And even now, after everything has been carried into silence, there is still one final truth that remains. Because what existed on that plantation in Georgia was never meant to be remembered clearly. It was meant to fade, to blur, to become something uncertain, and that is exactly how silence protects what it hides, not by erasing it completely, but by making it difficult to hold on to, difficult to define, difficult to prove. But even in that uncertainty, something remains, a trace, a feeling, a quiet awareness that something once existed that was never allowed to be fully known. The people who lived through it carried that awareness forward, not as a story, but as something deeper, something that shaped how they saw power, how they understood silence, how they recognized what was hidden, even when it was not spoken. Because once you experience something like that, you begin to see differently. You begin to notice what others overlook, to sense what others ignore, to understand that what is not said can be just as real as what is. That is what remained, not the details, not the names, but the understanding, a quiet recognition of how systems protect themselves, how silence can be enforced without words, how truth can exist without ever being acknowledged. Only something to recognize that history is not only made of what is recorded, it is also made of what is hidden, what is avoided, what is never allowed to become fully visible. And those parts of history do not disappear. They remain, in fragments, in impressions, in the quiet spaces where something feels incomplete. That is where this story rests, not in clarity, but in that incompleteness, a quiet, lasting gap between what is known and what was never allowed to be known. And once that gap is felt, it does not close. It stays. In thought, in awareness, in the moments where something feels just beyond reach. And when those moments come, just like before, everything feels slightly different. And that difference is enough to remind you that some truths were never meant to be told, only carried. And once carried, they remain, quietly, endlessly, and completely.